I'm Barry McGough. This is the first chapter of our predictive quarter report. We call it the Pluot report. This is where we're discussing what we learned from the first quarter of this year and trying to find lateral connections. The theme of this year's report, or this season's report, is the convergence, or how do we be better? So first off, we're going to talk about the moon. When we think about the moon, and I'm going to let you kind of dwell on this, this is actually recorded footage from the China National Space Administration of their lunar module that landed on the moon just this year. We think about the moon as some celestial object, but we're starting to see, through the convergence of science, technology, policy, business, and opportunity, that the moon is something that we need to pay attention to. We're going to talk about why. Back in 1950, Robert Heinlein wrote a series of science fiction books, and one of them was called The Man Who Sold the Moon. Inside that, there was a calendar where he talked about, in a very uncanny way, now that we can think about it, of what he thought was going to happen as a future history. The future history, he predicted in 1950 that the first rocket on the moon would be in 1978. It was actually in 1967 rather. So he wasn't far off. He predicted there would be lunar cities, that there would be something called the Space Precautionary Act, which there is actually policy around space and the moon right now. He talked about an era for 20 or for about 40 years where there would be something that would be something like interplanetary imperialism. He predicted wave mechanics, which is actually quantum. He talked about the prediction of synthetic food, weather control, and he even talked about what an era in 2125 and about 100 years from now, where he referred to it as our maturation as a species and how we end our own human adolescence. So a lot in here that he predicted, and some of it's starting to come true. Last year at South by Southwest, which is a very important show for us, with the convergence of ideas, of technology and policy and the creator community, and we talked about space. And one of our red threads was what is happening in space. We saw the zero gravity made in space companies. We saw conversations on space tourism. This was before Blue Origin. This was, they're talking about how we can start to be interplanetary. The poet laureate wrote and scribed a poem on the outside of the Jupiter launch mission, which launched last year. So space was a really big deal. But this year, it's really about the moon. This is a real video of the launch approach of the Firefly Aerospace Blue Ghost. Really, really quite beautiful and haunting images. This year, we at South by Southwest, there were over 50 references to space and the moon. There were 7 keynote and feature speakers. So there were things like out of this world, build a mobile network on the moon. We talked about meeting astronauts, Artemis 2, NASA's science and art of imaging extraterrestrial samples, living in space and where humanity meets space. So there was a tremendous amount of energy around space, and we really wanted to know why. So we started to pay attention to this. Just this year, for the first time in 16 years, the US launched and landed 2 different lunar modules. One was Firefly, that carried 10 NASA space payloads, and in January it launched and it achieved 100% of its mission. It's now actually officially, as of just last month, it entered monument status. It did everything it said it was going to do, and now it just sits there, and this is what it looks like. The next one was the lunar rover that went down at the South Pole, and this was the second robotic launch after Firefly, and it was part of a company called Intuitive Machines. Intuitive Machines landed, and it was going to test 4G cellular service. It was working with Nokia Bell, and what's interesting is that was kind of successful because it fell on its side. It landed and it wasn't destroyed, but a lot of the instrumentation didn't work. But what did work was the beta from Lonestar Data Holdings. They were actually on the Red Thread X stage in Austin this year, and Stephen Isley actually set up live telemetry where he was broadcasting from our stage onto the moon and back again, and we could see the telemetry of data going back and forth. So his company is around putting data centers on the moon. It makes a lot of sense, actually, because data has to be secure, and it has to be someplace where there's a lot of cold and a free access and ready access to energy, which you get both on the moon. It becomes very interesting. They also talked about Vera Rubin Observatory just going live and seeing parts of space that we've never been able to see before. And this was launched at the MIT Top 20 Technologies at South by Southwest. So we're starting to see an arc of storytelling and importance of the moon when we're at South by Southwest. So we started to go a little bit deeper. We think about some of the things that are happening right now with satellites. So at the beginning of the century, in the middle of the 21st century, there were about 14 nations operating satellites. You can see now that there are currently over 18,000 satellites in orbit. And there are 91 new countries that want to put satellites into space. This is interesting, because this points at an opportunity. The opportunity that McKinsey is talking about is a $1.8 trillion opportunity. So they're talking about things like space hotels, and they're also talking about something that is just starting to come into the conversation now around point-to-point suborbital travel. There is a conversation right now in the aerospace industry around bringing back supersonic planes, which is great. But what will be even faster is if you could launch from New York, go into the suborbit, and then back down to Paris in 25 minutes. That's going to be very, very interesting when we start to monetize space in ways that we never have been able to before. And with all the data that we're getting from all these satellites, it's going to become a lot easier. Now, NASA, their Artemis mission has really been about Mars. And they have been planning from Artemis 2 out to Artemis 6, different aspects and phases to get to Mars, using the moon as its base station. So next year, there will be a lunar core module that NASA will land onto the moon to begin their mission to Mars in 2031. And even this year, we're starting to see the International Lunar Space Station working between China and Russia to actually put base stations on the moon. What they're planning on doing is putting nuclear power plants on the moon too. So we're starting to think what could possibly go wrong with nuclear power stations on the moon. We're already talking about data centers, we're already talking about space hotels, and now we're talking about nuclear energy on the moon. But this is actually in the works, and they want to put this on the moon and live by 2035 in the next 10 years. Also ripped straight from the headlines is the James Webb Telescope just found a planet that we think is one of the closest habitable planets, because we can determine that on this planet called K2-18b, it's only 124 light years away. But if we could figure out how to get there, it's got two major components. It's got dimethyl sulfide and dimethyl disulfide. These indicate that we can put carbon-based life on the moon, on extraterrestrial planets, rather. So this is very interesting as we start to identify planets that move from the moon to Mars and out beyond as we become an interstellar species. So what are the implications of this? We think about this in terms of so what? Why would you pay attention to the moon? You pay attention to the moon because we can start to imagine future scenarios that we have to pay attention to. Right now, there is legislation working its way through Congress that is seeking to ban ads in that low Earth orbit space. That's interesting. Patagonia is launching an Earth First campaign where we're starting to see a backlash of people saying we need to take care of Earth before we think about being an interplanetary species. That becomes a political watch out for us, and it becomes a social watch out for us. One of the things that we think about with 18,000 and count, or 11,000 and counting satellites in space is the Kessler effect. If you haven't heard of it, it's something to pay attention to. The Kessler effect is the idea that an object or piece of space junk hits another satellite, it turns into 10,000 pieces of space junk. Those 10,000 pieces hit another 1,000 satellites, and all of a sudden, all the satellites go down, and there's a worldwide collapse of the things that we depend on for satellite technology: weather, finance, you name it. So the Kessler effect is something that we're going to have to start to pay attention to, and how do we clean up space junk? This becomes important. Sovereignty on space. One of the reasons why you're starting to see all these lunar landers launch on the moon, land there, and not do anything is because, according to International Space Treaty, any country that lands something on the moon has something like a 50-meter radius around it to call it its own territory. So the idea that people are going to claim sovereignty by just landing things on the moon is going to become more important. Green propulsion. How do we get to the moon? How do we take terrestrial technology and get to the moon without using fossil fuels, stage gates, things that are more self-sustaining? Mining and extraction. What will we take off the moon? And should we take minerals off the moon and then bring them into the terrestrial environment? That's an open question, but when we have these conversations here about the limitations around trading rare earth minerals and how important they are for our current level of technology, that becomes an interesting area of development and business. Space tourism. Will we live there? We're already seeing Blue Origin. We're already seeing Amazon launching near-Earth orbit. Katy Perry launches into space. We're also seeing the idea of space-based solar power. Japan this month will be the first to broadcast power from near-Earth orbit down onto Earth. So will we be generating solar energy from near-Earth orbit? Lunar data centers and the security that could bring to data, which is very important to us. We'll start to see more and more of that. And also things like zero-G factories. So when we think about the direction of travel for society, technology, business, enterprise, and investment, the moon becomes very, very interesting right now. I've excerpted here a couple of very good reports. Amy Webb and her Future Today strategy group has a 1,000-page report. What we've done here is we've excerpted the 90 pages on the moon specifically, which is a very, very great read. McKinsey has a really excellent report on your job in space. So you can grab this here, and Deloitte has something on tech space futures. So the major consultancy organizations are actually doing a lot of deep dive research to talk about the relevance of what space means to us. And there's even more out there if you want to reference the Robert Heinlein book, What Happens with the Moon, the Lunar Economy, and Moon as a Service. Here's a place where you can grab more. Thanks for joining. And remember, some of the choices that are around us we can make, some we should make, and some are being made for us. It's up to us to decide which. Thanks.